Hi, this is Douglas Kirk. It's October 24th, 2019, and we're at the cemetery where we were exactly 11 years ago today, and we had an encounter that led to the premise of the Look For Me series. It was right here in this cemetery on this day that we were here shooting a illustration for a newspaper article, and some strange stuff started happening to the model that I was working with. She looked over to the edge of the cemetery and she said that she sensed an entity who was upset, quite concerned about an injustice. Even though she didn't see this entity, she sensed her very, very strongly. She described her as not tall. Her hair was up in a bun. As a result of that encounter, the model, looked around the cemetery and arrived at this grave and said, "This is it, this is it. This is the grave that the entity is interested in." We tried to read it. It was dark. We had flashlights, but you just could not read what was written on the grave marker. It wasn't until 2012 that I came out here with the idea that I would do a tombstone rubbing, and I did that, and I was able to ascertain the name of the person who is interred here. Her name is Lily Bartles, and she died on September 5th, 1899. There's also something written at the bottom of the grave, which later on we determined is a verse from a song that was popular in Germany at the time, a hymn, a church hymn. We couldn't read it at the time, but the model did put her hand up on the top of the grave marker and say, "There's a lamb, there's a lamb." That means there's a child here. There's also something at the foot of the grave marker, and she asked me if I could read it, and I couldn't. And I still can't read it. It's a little different stone set in the concrete, I think, to signify that this is the length of the grave. Now, in 2012, when I was doing the tombstone rubbing, I noticed that there were two other graves joined to each other, Alex and Ida Bartles, and they also died as children. And then I noticed for the first time that right next to them, to the south of them, was Emma and Herman Bartles. Learning that, I started digging into the county records to determine what I could about this family. As it turns out, both Herman and Emma were 1 year apart in their birth. They were born in the 1860s. I think Herman died in 1936 and Emma died in 1962. Emma was put into a sanitarium shortly after her husband's death, and she remained there until 1962. It was the Comal Sanitarium. And I went in New Braunfels, looked up the address, and found the location. It's just an old house. I guess that's where people spent time if they had issues, whatever they might be, elderly, whatnot. I looked at the records. It appeared as though Emma had, I think it was about 10 children. Not unusual for the time. She came from a family of 12. But what was interesting to me is that Lily Bartles was not listed in a lot of the records. I found her in some of the records, but the cemetery records did not list her at all, which I thought was unusual. The idea that there was something special about this particular girl started in 2008 and really became obvious to us in 2015. I came out here, I think it was on May 6th, 2015. I was working with a young lady on some political activity. We were literally rolling newspapers and throwing them in driveways in order to affect an election. We were working against an issue that was coming to vote. And we'd worked 1 week, and then during that first week, we talked about the story regarding Lily Bartles. And she was interested in the story, but that first week, of course, we just threw the papers and it was late. I took her back to her car. She went home. The next week, the second week, she had indicated, I need to get home by 11 o'clock because I've got kids to get in bed. They got to go to school tomorrow. And so I said, okay, fine, I'll get you back to your car at 11 o'clock. What we did is we parked over at a nearby church. She drove from where she lives. I drove from where I live. We met there. She got in my vehicle with me, and we drove and threw the newspapers. Well, during that evening, we didn't mention this story at all. We had talked about it the week before. And it was like 2 or 3 minutes before 11 p.m. I was on the way back to the church to deliver her to her car so she could get home on time. And we were coming up to the stoplight. It was green, as I recall. It was green, and I said, hey, we're by the cemetery. Do you want to go check it out? I fully expected her to say no. To my surprise, she said, sure, we're here. Let's go look at it. So I went through the stoplight, or went through the signal, the intersection, did a U-turn, turned around, came back to the little crossroad where the cemetery is located, and drove over here. We actually drove past the cemetery, which I always do because there's no parking at this cemetery. It's right on a main road. So I drove past it so that I could turn my car the correct direction on the highway, and you just kind of pull over into the bar ditch. So this is now 11 o'clock at night, so obviously it's dark. So we came into the cemetery, and as we walked past the first grave that was here, a child that was buried here, I think in the 1870s. The very first grave, this was a big ranch. It's kind of a nice spot. There's oak trees, and it's kind of a hill. So that child was buried here, and it wasn't until years later that this became an actual cemetery where they deeded the property and said this is going to be a cemetery forever, which is what it is now. There's only about 60, maybe 65 graves here. So we stopped at that first grave, and she took a picture. I don't know why. She just, I guess, felt like she wanted to take a picture. She had her cell phone, so she took a photo. And at that point, something touched her ankle. I think it was then. It might have been when we got over next to Lily's grave. But I think it was then. Something touched her ankle. She picked her foot up. She thought it was a bug. She had pants on that came down just a little past her knees, so her calves were without clothing, socks pulled up. And so, her skin was bare there, so maybe a weed touched it, or we thought maybe a June bug because it was in May, a May beetle. Couldn't see anything, pointed out on the ground with a flashlight, couldn't see anything. So then we walked over here to Lily's grave. She took a picture of Lily's grave, and lo and behold, she felt something on her ankle again. Kind of did the little dance, and I said, well, what's wrong? Now, there's no audio of any of this because we didn't expect this to happen. She said, it's weird, something's getting me. So we just kind of passed it off as nothing. Then we went over to Ida and Alex's grave. As I recall, she took a picture of that also. Well, we talked a little bit about the story, and then as we were leaving the cemetery, maybe 30, 40 feet from where I'm seated now in front of Lily's grave, she picked up her foot a third time, and she said, something is touching my ankle. Now, this time, she felt like it was a thumb and a forefinger grasping her ankle, like tugging on it, getting her to not leave. She said it was very light touch, very gentle, but definitely she felt it. And so we said, well, that's weird. I mean, what can you conclude from that? Nothing really. what we did is we left the cemetery, went back to the car. As we were about to part, she got out of the vehicle, and when she stepped on the ground, she felt her tennis shoe was soft on the sole. I said, "That's strange." So she said, "Well, feel my shoe." And I did, and there wasn't anything wrong with the shoe. It was just the sole of a shoe. But she said it felt soft. Just the one leg that had been touched. She said she continued to feel something like touching her leg. She drove home. Oh, we made a recording of that. We took out the audio. We talked about it. We made a recording of that. So then she drove home. She told me later that the feeling in the foot lasted a little while. Then when she went to sleep that night, she woke up in the 4 o'clock hour, 4:30, 4:45, something like that, having had a very vivid dream. She called me the next day, texted me, and then we talked, and she said the weirdest dream took place. And I asked her, "Do you have vivid dreams all the time?" She says no, but she says she dreams almost every day, but they're not vivid. She'd only had 2 really vivid dreams prior to that related to her brother, who she was very close to. But other than that, her dreams are just normal dreams like people have. They're not vivid. Until this happened, and that would have been on the morning of May 7th, since we were here at the cemetery May 6th, I think. I said, "Well, what was in the dream?" And so she described the dream. She said that she was in a hurry, walking very, very fast toward a creek. There were oak trees. It was fall. There were leaves on the ground. She could feel it crunching. It was cool. The air was cool. She said she had a wool cloak on. She had high boots that came up just below her knees, like riding boots. She described that they didn't have heels, but those people who ride horses know that typically a riding boot has got a heel to keep your foot from slipping through the stirrup. But that's what she described. It didn't feel like she had heels. The material was a damask, kind of a green material. As she walked briskly toward this creek, she saw somebody bent over in the creek. It was a man. There was a newsboy hat sitting on the bank. He had a jacket on, like a suit jacket. He was hunched over. She could see his rear end. The pants didn't have any pockets in them. And he was flailing with something in the water, splashing. But she couldn't see because the bank went over toward the water, and she couldn't see what was happening down at the level of the water. But she recognized this guy. He had brown hair, and she called out, and she said, "This is in the dream. This is the woman in the dream who she was inside of. She was part of this person." She called out. She said, "Jacob!" She said, as soon as she said that, it was like the camera turned around, and she saw the face of the woman. Very clearly saw the face of the woman, and she had an open mouth, shocked eyes. At that point, she woke up. So that's the dream, the first dream she had. It's starting to rain now, by the way. I may have to move. It's actually raining pretty hard now. So it is raining fairly briskly, very sudden. I'm not surprised. I mean, we were told it would rain, but I'm having to move from the gravesite over to the car. It's interesting to me that the rain came just as I told the story of that dream. Who has that kind of control, right? It'll take a minute to get squared away. The rain stopped about the time I got everything into the car, but I hear thunder. And so I don't think it's a good idea to go back out there, because it's going to rain pretty hard here in a second. So I had to relocate from the graveyard to my car, which is sitting right in front of the graveyard. It suddenly rained as soon as I told that story about Jacob. It suddenly rained really hard. By the time I got my equipment picked up and brought to the car, the rain stopped. There's rain clouds in all directions. A minute ago I heard thunder. So I expect that we're going to get quite a bit of rain. The weather predicted that we were. I just found that odd. I tell the story and that's what happens. Getting back to May 7th, 2015, we talked about that dream and how vivid it was. Well, lo and behold, over the next few days, she had that dream 2 more times. We called it the Jacob dream. She also had a dream we called the running dream. This is where it was almost like a continuation of the first dream, where the man, whatever he was doing in the river, he dropped that, he jumped up and he ran after the person who we believe is Emma. We believe the person that saw Jacob doing something in the creek is Emma. We believe that's the lady that reached out to us in 2008. We think it's the same person, and we think that her concern is the grave of her daughter, Lily. And the grave, by the way, says that she is the daughter of Herman and Emma Bartles. So it says that. We're pretty sure that that's the case. Why would they put that on the grave? But what's odd is when you look at the records, very often Lily Bartles is not included in the records. There's a few places where I did find her, but there's a lot of places where she's not part of the list of children. I don't understand that. So in the running dream, what happens is that this man jumps up from the river, leaves what he's doing, and he runs after this person. She says, the lady that's reporting this to me says that she heard his feet coming, and then he kind of pushed her down and jumped on her, and she's face up, and he's sitting on her pelvis, pinned her down. She says that he's extremely strong. He's got a hot breath, and he has kind of a musky smell about him. He holds each of his hands, he holds her hands back and kind of grinds her into the ground. She says she feels like the rocks on the dirt are grinding into her back. And I asked her in real life if there were any marks, and she said she looked and there weren't. But she doesn't see him, because what he does is he puts a cloth over her face, and she describes it as an oily smell. She says, almost like you smell at a train yard, which is very significant that she would say that. That dream concluded, I'm not sure if it was in that dream or a different dream, where she says, no, you must stop, you must stop. I'm not sure if that's in that same dream or if that's a different dream, because she had a series of dreams. So then she had another dream, which we named the walking dream. And this is where she's walking, this person is walking with a man. The woman is a little shorter than the man. They obviously know each other, but they're not touching each other. They're walking along this gravel pathway. It's like the width of a road, and it's gravel, and it's straight, and it goes way off into the distance, and it kind of goes up and down over the hills, and it's gravel. She said she can feel the crunching. Now, at first, she's behind the couple, and they're talking. As she continues, suddenly she's in the body of the woman. And she looks up at the man, and he's got the newsboy hat on, but there's no face. Cannot see his face at all. So then she looks at her hand, or at some point in the dream, she looks at her hand, and there's like a cut on her palm. It has dried blood on it. She also notices, she looks down and she sees her chest, her own chest. So she sees her own breasts. She's wearing a yellow embroidered dress, which is yellow on yellow, so two colors of yellow, but it's very intricate embroidery work on the dress. She sees that. And they're talking, but she doesn't know what they're saying because it's not very loud. So that's the walking dream. And then there was a dream called the blood dream. This is a name we gave it. She says that she's very, very cold. When she reported the dream to me, she said that she mentioned the word I was freezing or I was cold about 6 or 7 times. I mean, she was cold, very, very cold. She could not move at all. She looked at her own arm. It was like a child's arm. She described it like her own daughter's arm. It was a small child's arm. And she was very scared and very cold. She was laying on some kind of metal table. She could see the wall, and it was square tiles, maybe about 4.5-inch square tiles, 5-inch square tiles. And then up above that was a transom. And she saw a cabinet, a wooden cabinet. She said it was a nice wooden cabinet, something that had drawers and doors in it and ornate feet. And then she saw, or she heard drip, 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 and there was a tube leading from her, and it was filled with blood, dark blood. Not bright blood, dark blood. The reason that's significant is that when a person is alive, his blood is a brighter red than when he's dead. When he's dead, the blood darkens. She was very scared, and she was wanting to cry, but she could not cry. Then when she woke up, in real life, there were tears all over her face as she had been crying. That's a basic set of dreams. So then, on October 23rd, 2016, I came over here to shoot a political advertisement. This was just prior to the 2016 election, and I had 2 T-shirts. One shirt said, "Hillary gives me anxiety." The other T-shirt said, "Trump gives me anxiety." I wanted my model. This is a different model. This is a third person. I wanted her to put on both of those shirts one at a time. I have a technique where I can put her photo in the same image where it looks like she's fighting herself. And the headline to the ad was going to be, "Even the Dead People Don't Know How to Vote." And we worked on this, and it became midnight, and it was October 24th. While we were working, trying to get this photo, this model, the third model, she heard noises over in the corner of the cemetery, over where the Bartles grave was. She would hear it, it would scare her, and she would drop what she was doing, and she'd run over next to me. She was just frightened. This happened several times. Now, this is all on audio. I didn't have video going, but I did have audio. And she keeps running over to me several times until finally she saw something. Now, we're talking saw with her own eyes. She saw a woman who was walking fast from the north part of the cemetery to the south part of the cemetery. Now, incidentally, this is an old German graveyard, so the headstones are all to the west, the feet are all to the east, they're all lined up. It's north, south, east, west. That's the way German cemeteries are done. When she saw this, she was so scared she started crying. She ran over to me, she grabbed me, she said, "I can't do this." So I said, "Well, what do you want to do?" Because we weren't finished with the photo shoot. I wanted to get the picture. She said, "We need to take a break." So we came back over to the car, we sat down. That's when I put on the video, and you can see her crying. I mean, this scared her to the point of tears. We talked about it. She recounted the story, and then I said, "Can we go back and finish?" Because we hadn't gotten the shot. Reluctantly, she went back. We shot a few more pictures. I think she again heard some noises after that. We did have the video running at that point, but didn't see anything. Nothing shows up in the video. So that was in 2016. Now it's 2019. I've been over here several times with different people. Since then, nothing has transpired. Nothing at all. I don't know if Emma has gone dormant. I have no idea. Now, an interesting back note. 1996, a friend of mine called me on the phone, and he said, "I've got hay in the field, Doug. Can you come and help me? It's about to rain." I said, "Sure, I know the drill. I've put hay on a trailer before." I told him I'd help him, so I went over and I helped him. We loaded up this hay on a truck, and then we took it, put it in the barn, and stacked it in the barn. And we did that till the hay was out of the field. There wasn't anybody on this ranch, a bunch of old buildings. And I didn't know anything about the ranch. I just helping out a buddy, that's all it was. And that was in 1996. Well, in 2016 or 17, I was at the county clerk's office looking up the address of the Bartles Ranch. I had gotten it once before. I had the address, but I didn't know exactly where it was. So finally, I got one of the clerks to help me locate it on the map. And to my utter shock and surprise, the Bartles Ranch was the ranch where my buddy had asked me to help get hay out of the field. And I talked to him later about that. I said, "What's the deal with this ranch?" And he said, "Oh, yeah, that's the Bartles Ranch." I said, "What?" Now, if Herman Bartles died in 1936 and Emma Bartles died in 1962, then it went down to another Bartles. And there were a bunch of Bartles. There were brothers. I think at one point I found in the records that Emma and Herman Bartles sold the ranch, moved to a different place. So I'm not sure if this is where they originated or where they ended up. I think it's where they originated. And what's interesting about the ranch is it's bounded on one side by the Guadalupe River, but there's a creek that runs along the eastern border. A creek. So when I discovered that the creek was there, I thought, man, that sounds like the dream. Because when the second lady saw the man flailing in the creek, she described it as not a big wide river. It was a creek. It was fairly wide, she described it to me maybe 30, 40 feet across. But it wasn't the river. It wasn't the Guadalupe River, which is going to be wider than that. It was a creek. I thought, wow, maybe that's where the incident took place. My friend that I helped with the hay told me that, oh yeah, back in the day, his grandfather, he's a fifth or sixth generation Texan, this guy that I know, and he said, yeah, back in the day, his grandfather used to get into fights with the Bartles, I think he said, because they would play poker. They would lose the deed to their property. Next day, they'd try to take it back, and he described, my buddy described an incident where they were fighting in the river, two guys fighting over the ranch, or a ranch. I'm not sure if it was the ranch, but a ranch. And this is in the 1800s. So now, what about Jacob? Who's Jacob? And that's been the question for a long time. Who is Jacob? I went to the county clerk's office soon after we heard the name Jacob, and I asked the clerks there, can you help me find a guy by the name of Jacob in the 1800s? And they kind of laughed, and they said, everybody was named Jacob, or there's a lot of Jacobs. It's going to be really difficult. But one of the clerks said that she wasn't busy and she'd help me look. So they have indexes. So she was going down through the index, and she came upon a entry that had a pencil check mark in front of it, which is unusual because all of these records are written in pen and ink. Nobody puts a pencil check mark in the records. I mean, they're not supposed to. But there was a pencil check mark in front of Jacob Sharp Wetmore and John S. Barnes, trustees of the Houston Great Northern Railroad, selling Houston Great Northern Railroad property to themselves. They were self-dealing. I thought, whoa, that's interesting. Well, right about that same time, my cell phone rang, which I had on me, but because I was in the clerk's office, I didn't answer the phone. Just out of courtesy, I didn't answer the phone. But I saw who it was. It was my friend who had been to the cemetery in May of 2015. And this phone call took place in 2015. When I got out of the clerk's office, I called her back, and she said the weirdest thing happened. She was at work, and she had a T-shirt on that had a train on it. And a customer came in, and he said, oh, I see you like trains. And she said, yeah, I like trains. And they started talking about trains. She's originally from Nebraska, and, the Transcontinental Railroad went through there. She said her father was always interested in trains, and then she was interested in trains. And she said, yeah, as a matter of fact, my kids love the train over at the Texas Transportation Museum. I guess the guy asked, have you ever heard of the Texas Transportation Museum? She said, yeah, sure. We're members over there. We go and ride the train. The kids love riding the train. Well, I guess as soon as he left, she, just out of curiosity, she Googled the Texas Transportation Museum, and it said online that it is built in the town of Wetmore, Texas. It said that Wetmore, Texas was established by a guy by the name of Jacob S. Wetmore. So when she saw that, she saw the name Jacob, because she knew, she and I were both interested. Who's Jacob? That's when she called me. I was at the clerk's office, didn't answer the phone, but she was discovering Jacob Wetmore right about the same time I was discovering Jacob Wetmore. Now, that's interesting because I had been to the cemetery a couple days prior to that, and I stood at the fence. I didn't go in, stood at the fence. I said, Emma, wo ist Jacob's Nachname? What is Jacob's last name? Because we didn't know. We had no idea, and it's a needle in a haystack. But then a couple days later, Jacob S. Wetmore is revealed to us. Now, here's an interesting thing. When you go in the records, these Germans, they were Jakob, Y-A-K-O-B, and a couple other spellings, but you pronounce it Jakob. You do not pronounce it Jacob. But clearly in the dream, it was Jacob. Why wouldn't it be Jakob? Emma was German. Why wouldn't she say Jakob? Why would she say in English pronunciation Jacob? So that was puzzling until I started researching Jacob Sharp Wetmore. Turns out that he's not German at all. His forefathers fought in the Revolutionary War. The Wetmore family was very wealthy, had a bunch of kids, and they were in finance. And apparently the reason he ended up as a trustee on the Houston Great Northern Railroad is because of his monetary connections. He was married. He had, I think, 2 children, one of whom died before he did. A daughter died before he did. And he was on this board of trustees, and the charter for the Houston Great Northern Railroad was to run a railroad from Houston to the north to the Red River. That was their charter. Well, if you do that, you have to go through what's called the Piney Woods of Texas, and it's a lot of pine trees. You got to cut them down to lay track. During this period, the after post-Civil War, 1800s, there was a frenzy all over the United States to build railroads. Just a frenzy. The federal government, if they owned the land, they were granting 16 sections of land for every mile of track. So you would get 16 sections of territory given to the railroad company for every mile of track that you laid. Now, a section is 1 mile by 1 mile, 640 acres. And they did it in a checkerboard fashion. The reason being is they wanted the railroad to own segments of the land, and then they wanted the public to come in and fill in between. And this was the way they were planning to encourage development. Of course, anytime you put in a railroad, there's going to be development. That goes without saying. The railroad was the lifeline in the United States prior to the Civil War, and then especially after the Civil War when we ended up in the Industrial Revolution. Texas had a deal with the Houston Great Northern Railroad, which was a little different. They gave them 20 sections of land for every mile of track that they laid. And I found out the reason they had such a good deal is that the Houston Great Northern Railroad had one of their members on the state legislature, Texas legislature. So they had a better deal than almost anybody. Thought that was interesting. But they didn't build the railroad to the Red River. They came west, and they went from Houston to New Braunfels to San Antonio. And I thought, that's odd. Well, it makes sense. It's a lot easier to build in the Texas Hill Country because you don't have to cut down all these pine trees. And so you can gobble up a lot more land quickly. And that's what they were doing, because there were a lot of railroad companies trying to gobble up land. Of course, the Transcontinental Railroad that went from Omaha, Nebraska, west, one railroad company building there. You had another railroad company out in California building toward the east, and they were going to meet. They met at Promontory Point, Utah. There was so much corruption. It was unbelievable. In Omaha, what they did is they would build out into the prairie and turn and come back to the town. All this while they're selling stock to people. Then they would sell stock to people, and then the trustees of these railroad companies would own a bunch of stock that they would sell, and then the president of the railroad would announce, well, we're not going to use Loop A, we're going to do a different route. So everybody would rush to buy stock to the new loop, and then he kept doing this. Basically, the trustees were making a ton of money off of this, and Congress was involved. It was great corruption. Eventually, I think it was after 3 years of doing this in the Omaha, Nebraska area, finally they started building west in order to complete the Transcontinental Railroad, which is what they were chartered to do. There were a lot of lawsuits when I looked into the documents regarding the Houston Great Northern Railroad and Jacob Wetmore. He was involved in a number of lawsuits, stock schemes and things like that. And as I researched him, I found out that 2 of the members of the Board of Trustees were murdered. And then I also found in the archives, newspaper archives, that his cousin was murdered. He was partners with his cousin, partners with him in the lumber business. And that makes total sense. A railroad as these towns were developing, they needed railroad ties, which were lumber, and they needed wood to build towns, which was lumber. There's this newspaper account of the cousin being murdered, and the son, the headline was that he committed suicide, but the son is saying he did not commit suicide. Things were going well. There's no way it was suicide, but it's very fishy, and it does appear as though he was murdered. So Jacob Wetmore is associated with 3 murders that are documented. Now the question is, was he associated with the murder of Lily Bartles on September 5th, 1899? Our speculation is that Lily Bartles was the product of an affair between Jacob Wetmore and Emma Bartles. Now, we don't know that for a fact, but the dreams lead us to believe that. It's odd that Lily is not showing up in the records the way all the other children are. So it's almost like they don't want to recognize this child. It's gotten dark now. It's not pitch dark, but it's pretty darn dark. I can still see some skylight, and I'm seeing lightning all around me. Before the break, we were starting to talk about what happened to Lily Bartles. We honestly don't know for sure. We think, based upon the dreams, that she was murdered. We think that she was the product of an affair between Emma Bartles and Jacob Wetmore. We don't know that to be true. The idea is a possibility. We're getting this from the dreams. It could be totally wrong. I don't know. If it is wrong, I apologize to Emma for misunderstanding. But that's what we think happened. So it's almost dark here at the cemetery. The air temperature very suddenly is starting to drop dramatically. It's quite cold now. I'm still in my t-shirt, and I'm still wet from when I was out in the cemetery when it rained suddenly, and I'm cold. I'm going to have to put on my shirt here in a minute, probably. In describing the cemetery, there's just a little bit of skylight on the horizon. There is no moon, and it's overcast, so you can barely see the graves. The only thing you see is when the lightning lights them up. There is a fair amount of lightning in the distance to the south. There is some lightning in the distance to what looks like the north. And the wind is picked up, and it's a cold wind. It's a very cold wind. And I really have to put my shirt on. This is the reason I brought it, and before it was too hot. I'm going to have to get outside in order to put it on. So this is, it's windy outside. I'm going to put, and it's one of those cold winter wind kind of things. I'm going to have to put the windows up, at least that side, partially, because the rain's coming in through the window. Now, we're getting a call, which I hadn't anticipated, or that's an email. Let's see what that says. Okay, so this is from my friend. Says, was going to try to make it to meet today, but it looks like some serious rain is coming. See you tomorrow. Yeah, I believe the business about the serious rain. So what do we know? We know that Jacob's name was pronounced Jacob, which is English. It's not Jakob. This is a German community. All the gravestones are written in German. They say gestorben, which is died, geboren, which is born. We know that we're getting serious rain now. I got to put up the other window. We know that this was a small German community. The Starts family was located in this area. 12 kids. The Bartles family was located in this area. I think it was 10 kids. And, of course, they all had brothers and sisters, so that a lot of related. In fact, the Starts and the Bartles family intermarried twice. There was a Emma Starts and there was a Emma Bartles, and they married across families. What I don't know and have not been able to demonstrate is a connection between Jacob Wetmore and Emma Bartles. I want a paper connection. I have not been able to do that. A paper connection meaning I would like to put them in the same church. I would like to put them in the same organization. He was a prominent railroad trustee in the city of New Braunfels. So he was a big shot. She was a young German woman, and a very pretty girl, by the way. From we have two photos of her. One where she's 70 years old. The other one we don't know how old she was, but she was an attractive woman. Did she meet him in New Braunfels at some point? Was she attracted to him because he was prominent and wealthy? Why would she have an affair? You look at her husband, there's only two pictures of him that I've been able to locate, and in both of those pictures, he doesn't look like a pleasant man. Now, that doesn't mean that he wasn't. He just doesn't look pleasant. He looks kind of mean. And he was a lot bigger than her. So did he abuse her? We don't really know. This is all pure speculation. Nobody writes that down. I went to the Sophienberg Museum and I looked up the newspaper accounts from the day in a newspaper called the Zeitung. I couldn't find any of those names listed anywhere in and around 1899. But I didn't look at year after year after year because it was very difficult. The German is written in Altdeutsch, which is an old type style, and it's very, very difficult to read. My German is not that great. I do have a friend who said that she would help me look, which maybe someday we'll do that, because German eyes would probably be better at spotting something in this mass of type, Altdeutsch type. We know that Jacob Wetmore went back and forth to New York and New Jersey. He was part of the New York Texas Land Company. He was on that board. There's newspaper accounts where he's attending meetings. His name is listed in the newspaper account. And then, as I said, he's at least 3 people that he personally knew were murdered. That's pretty interesting. And he's definitely not a German. He's English, I guess, Wetmore, but he's not German descent at all. Therefore, he's not being called Jakob, he's being called Jacob. The association with the railroad, I think it's interesting how the oily cloth that was covered over the woman's face in the dreams smelled oily, like, and was described as being what you'd see in a train yard. We didn't know there was a train connection when that was described in the dream, so that's interesting. I did go to the Catholic church that was here in the 1890s, and I looked for baptismal records to see if there were any records of the Bartles, and there were not. They were not Catholics, apparently, but there was a First Protestant church. I did go to the First Protestant church, but it was closed, and I haven't been back. But I will check the records there to see if there's any mention of any of the Bartles' children being baptized. Incidentally, back in those days, they did not keep birth records, and they did not necessarily keep death records. So I found no record for Lily Bartles whatsoever, no birth record, no death record. It is raining really, really hard right now, and it's quite cold outside. The windows are all fogged up in the car. There's a little bit of traffic on the road, which is odd because for a long time there wasn't anything, but somebody's coming through this area. This weather is unusual for us this time of year. This is like a sudden downpour, cold front blowing through. I mean, I say unusual, I guess it happens, but this year we haven't had it very much. Now, with respect to the cold weather, there was exceptionally cold weather in 1899. So much so that Galveston Bay froze. It was a very, very cold year. That could explain why in September, the person in the dream, who we believe is Emma, was wearing a cloak and a heavy wool cloak and was dressed warmly on September 5th. Now that can happen. Today is October 24th, and you would want to wear some jacket today. I mean, now. Earlier in the day, I was hot in a t-shirt, but now it's cold. Tomorrow it'll be cold. So could it have been cold on September 5th? Yeah, it could have been. So in the dream, we don't really know what date it was, other than it seemed to be fall because of the leaves that had fallen on the ground, and it was cold. We don't know that it was September 5th. We're just assuming that it was September 5th. And we're assuming that this guy, Jacob, is doing something in the river we think might be related to Lily Bartles. Well, there's no proof of that. We just think that. It is a mystery, and there's a lot of research to be done. With respect to the book series, Look For Me Season 1 is not about this topic at all. The encounter that we had in October of 2008 gave me the idea for this series, and it quite literally because while I was packing up my gear, I don't like people to help me do it. I like to put things in their particular pockets, so next time you go to get them, they'll be in the right spot. So I just asked my model to have a seat and wait. And she was waiting, we were talking, I was packing up, and she shined the flashlight out on the gravestones. She said, these people aren't dead, you know. And I said, what? And she proceeded to explain to me that these grave markers are just one marker in their life. That led me to start thinking in terms of, that would make an interesting story. And that's where I came up with the idea. And literally on October 24, 2008, I went home and I wrote 2 pages of notes that eventually led to season 1, books number 1, 2, 3, and 4. When I wrote book number 1, I didn't think I was writing a series, but the characters wouldn't let go of me, so they wanted to be written about, so that's how I got 2, 3, and 4. Then when I was through with 4 in 2011, I thought, all right, that's it, I'm done. But I think it was around 2014 I wrote book number 5, or at least started on it. I continued off and on. I wrote 5, 6, 7, and 8 between that date and 2018 is when I finished that. The reason it took longer is because I did a lot of research into this mystery, and I wanted to incorporate a fictionalized version into the story. So season number 2, we have similar characters to season number 1, and some of the same characters. But we also have a historically accurate, fictionalized version of what we think took place in the 1890s here in Comal County. After I finished season 2 in 2018, I started working on the process of creating the gift box sets, which I'm very proud of. I think they're really nice with all the secrets inside. I think they're really cool. So then I started writing season 3, and fairly rapidly I wrote book number 9, 10, and 11. And I am now starting on number 12. Number 12 will be the culmination of season 3. Season 3 is also a complete departure from the first 2 seasons. I have some of the same characters. I introduce new characters. I introduce new abilities, which I'm having a lot of fun with. Advanced remote viewing is some of the stuff that we're working with. I should probably finish number 12 this year. It's 2019. I'm hoping that season 3 will be produced in production in 2020 and be out in 2020. I'm going to look at the time. Now in Croatia, Sonia was remote viewing. It's 7:36. This is a direct message. I'm going to try to see if she can pick it up remotely, 5,000 miles away. And the message is Puno Trece, which is Croatian. I'm probably pronouncing it incorrectly. Puno Trece. That's Croatian for may your life always be blessed. Our experiment is, will she pick up the fact that I'm speaking Croatian? Will she get that? I mean, that's not something she would expect. Even though she taught me that stuff, we haven't talked about it in months. You know, I asked her, teach me a few phrases. We haven't talked about it since then, so it's kind of a random thing that she may or may not pick up on. We'll see. One thing she already picked up on, which is interesting, I was going to come over here tonight at 8 o'clock with 2 or 3 people that wanted to come down from Austin. And I looked at the weather report, texted them and said, hey, at 8 o'clock, going to be bad weather. I mean, that's what we got right now. It's 7:36, 7:37, and it's pouring down, raining, and it's cold. Would have been a bad time to bring somebody to the cemetery. So I did not tell Sonia that, but Sonia wrote me earlier today, and she says, I see that you're going to be there by yourself. I wrote her back, and I said, yeah, you're right, because the others had canceled. My other friend who texted me just a few minutes ago, I had sent him a text saying, hey, no, we're gonna go over to the cemetery at 8. He just texted and say, hey, it looks like it's going to be bad weather. I'm not going to come. Okay? Sonia was right. I'm here by myself. I did send her an email, and I said, hey, I'm going to come at 6 instead of 8, and I'll stay from 6 to 8. That'll give her a 2-hour window of opportunity to see if she can pick up anything. Now, one thing she did, which I think is interesting, we talked about this story. She said she can do remote viewing, which I thought, that's interesting. This remote viewing is something that a lot of people don't even accept, but the CIA, the U.S. Navy, the U.S. Army, NASA, Stanford University, they've all done projects, scientific projects, and they're very convinced that remote viewing is a real thing. And when I talked to Sonia about that, she said, oh yeah, everybody's doing it. We don't talk about it, people don't believe it. The CIA put millions of dollars into it for 23 years. And then I guess when it leaked out that they were doing it, they announced that, well, you know, it doesn't work. We're not doing it anymore. Which, since when do you believe the CIA with respect to anything? I asked Sonia if she could remote view the cemetery, and she said, sure, I'll go check it out. She did. Then I said, can you look at the Bartles homestead? She said, okay. So she sent me 2 diagrams that showed 3 buildings. These 3 buildings, I had to drive over there to check it. I wanted to walk on the ranch, but it's all locked up, no trespassing, so I had to shoot pictures from across the fence. And there are, in fact, 3 buildings located where she said they were in the diagram. The interesting thing is she showed that 2 of the buildings have an unusually steep roof, and the other one is like a flat roof, or not flat, but not as steep. She located the fence, she located the creek, she located telephone poles. I would say in comparing her diagram to reality on the ground, she was about 60% correct. Now people say, oh yeah, she could have Googled that. But no, you can't Google this ranch. It's not listed that way. You got to have more information than to Google. I mean, there's a lot of ranches here, and the Bartles family is here. You can't just Google Bartles Ranch, Bartles family, and go to that location. So she didn't Google it. Number one, I believe her, and number two, if somebody tried to do that, it would be very, very difficult. So given that ability, tonight we decided, okay, I'm going to be over here. Let's see if you can come and pick up on anything that I'm doing. And she doesn't know what I'm doing. All she knows is that I came here. She doesn't know that I'm making this audio. She does know the weather's going to be bad because I told her that. But she doesn't know that I was going to say puno trece in Croatian as a message to her. I told her I would send her a message, but she doesn't know what it is. So we'll see what she picks up, if anything. I find remote viewing to be fascinating. Apparently people are able to do that. I've kind of played with it some and don't really feel like I've had much success, but maybe marginal, limited, trying to reach out and go places to people's houses, for instance. I've tried to do that. I think with a little bit of success, but I'm by no means very reliable. I believe that we all, when we're born, have the connection senses. Now, by that I mean, if you look at our regular senses, what you would call the external senses, your five typical senses that people talk about, which are vision, olfaction, audition, gustation, and taction. Everybody knows about those. Everybody uses those. You're born with those. You don't have to be taught to use them. We also have internal senses, which people don't realize, but here's an example. If you close your eyes and say, I want to touch my nose, you can do it. You can touch your nose. Well, how do you do that? It's because the internal senses, there's a feedback system within your nervous system to tell you where your hand is in space and to tell you where your nose is and allow you to have the motor control to move your hand over to your nose. Everybody can do that unless they're drunk or something. We have other kinds of internal senses, but I also believe we have some distance senses, and I call them connection senses. You connect with people, and why is that? I mean, sometimes you'll meet someone who you've never met before. You feel like you've known them. Now, is that because your souls have known each other in the past? Possibly. Is it because you have a connection in present day? Possibly. The connection senses would be things like telepathy. Telepathy is defined as being able to read another person's mind or read his thoughts. That's been demonstrated in the laboratory. It's absolutely real. Telekinesis is where you're able to move things at a distance. Clairvoyance is an ability to predict something that hasn't happened yet. So you've got precognition, you've got postcognition. Precognition is being able to tell what's going to happen in the future. Sometimes clairvoyance is considered the same thing. And then postcognition is where you're able to think about things after the fact. Pre is before, post is after. So you can get thoughts before, after, and during. Remote viewing is where you're able to take your mind and place it in another time and place. With remote viewing, I understand that time and space are irrelevant. They don't exist. You can go anywhere, anytime, any place, past, present, future. Your mind can jump to these locations. And then advanced remote viewing is where you literally project your physical being to that location. When you're there, you can manipulate things as though you were there. This is related somehow to what they call astral projection, out-of-body experiences. These apparently are well documented. The advanced remote viewing is not so well documented, may or may not be possible. But wouldn't it be interesting if you could ARV anytime you wanted to any place you wanted and manipulate the environment while you're there? Now, on top of this, you have different realms. I consider them different life ways. So your soul can exist on different planes, different realms, or different life ways. So the same soul can have experiences in two different places, or maybe 3 or 4 or 100, multiple life ways. That's not documented very well, but it is reported. People talk about that. What's interesting about the paranormal is that we don't have good scientific evidence on a lot of these things, but that's not a problem. We're working on getting scientific evidence. In psychology, I consider it the flat earth concept. Back before they knew the world was round, everybody thought it was flat. And so they assumed it was flat, and everything they talked about fit into that mindset of it being flat, or that zeitgeist. Zeitgeist being defined as the intellectual climate. Well, psychology is in the flat earth world. In psychology, we only address those things that we understand, and we tend not to address those things that we don't understand. But just because you don't understand it doesn't mean it's not real. The question is, can we approach it scientifically so that we can convince one another that what we're talking about is real? Number one. And number two, can we develop these abilities, which apparently we're all born with, we just don't use them? Can we develop these abilities? One that would be very handy is telepathy. Very handy if you could just think something and another person would receive it, and vice versa. And I know that happens. I've experienced that. Most people have experienced that. It's usually between people that are fairly close. So the next step, when you've got telepathy, now your mind is starting to reach out. Okay, now reach out further and look around. That's remote viewing. And then the next step would be advanced remote viewing. Go there. Not only go look, but go there and do something while you're there. It's a very real possibility. So season 3 kind of explores those things in psychology. The 3 seasons, 1, 2, and 3, they're kind of a complete unit. I don't know if there will be a season 4. Right now I'm planning on there being 3 seasons. But I've said that many times, oh, I'm done, but then end up not being done. What's interesting about this field is you can go in many, many directions. And when you take it and fictionalize it, take the real things that we know about and use them as devices with fictional characters, it's pretty fun. I get a kick out of it. I can sit in front of my computer and put my mind into this fictional world and almost see it, feel it, taste it, and it becomes very real. I hope that that happens to the reader as well. I hope that I'm just the guide and I'm just showing the reader some of the possibilities. I hope that's the case. The rain is about over. I say over, I mean the main force of the rain has come and gone. We still have some coming down. It's still quite cold. I've got the windows closed, so I don't know if there's wind, and there's not enough light for me to see. We're still getting lightning, but I can't see the trees to see whether or not there's wind, and I don't want to roll the windows down, because if I do, I'm going to lose the heat that I have. It's at this point where I would say, well, has anybody got any questions? This has been 2 hours, longer than a person should be allowed to talk. I'm sure that there's things that I missed, that I didn't discuss. There's a lot of details they come across in the books that I just forget. And this is an interesting thing. I write these books, and as soon as I write them, I forget them. That's kind of cool, because then when I pick up the book a year or 2 or 3 years later and I read it, I kind of read it fresh. I still know what it says, but I've forgotten the details, and so it's fresh. And I like that, because I don't want to be in the position where I can never enjoy my own books. We're kind of in that anyway, because once you write something, you'd have to have your mind erased. You'd have to go get electroshock therapy, have your mind erased so that you can read it fresh for the first time. Wouldn't that be a trip? I do have some scenes in season 2 that are ripped out of the pages of reality, some of the weird science in psychology. I'm a psychologist, but I don't respect the field of psychology when it comes to clinical psychology. And the reason I don't respect it is because there's some pretty archaic and brutal things that go on. Once upon a time in psychology, if a person was nuts, they'd drill a hole in his head, hang him by his feet, and spin him round and round in order to get the spirits to leave. Now, I don't know who thought of that, but they actually did that. They thought if a person was crazy, he was possessed by demons or spirits. Maybe that's true, maybe it's not. I don't know, but that's not a way to get rid of them. And then later on, patient would just be locked away and left for years and years and years. I mean, it makes me wonder, why was Emma Bartles in the Comal Sanitarium from around 1936 to 1962? What was the reason for that? Her sister, I found her death certificate, and on her death certificate it said contributing causes of death: deformed, blind, and insane. I thought, wow, that was her sister. But back in those days, in the early 1900s, they were pretty brutal if somebody was not normal. They did call people insane, and they had all kinds of designations. They call them idiots. They didn't have good therapeutic techniques. Well, at some point, somebody figured out, and this is, I think, in the 40s, it got popular in the 50s, the prefrontal lobotomy, which is where they would literally go in through the soft spot in the side of your face, feel where your eye is, and then go to the side of the face. There's a soft spot there. So they would drill a hole there and stick a scalpel in there, and they would use the bone as a fulcrum, and they would cut the connection between your brain and the prefrontal cortex. That was called a prefrontal lobotomy. They were cutting off the front part of your brain. Well, the front part of your brain is responsible for your personality. And so if somebody was nuts, they couldn't get him to do what they wanted, they would lobotomize them. And that happened to several 100,000 people before they realized, this is not a very good idea. I mean, they turned these human beings into vegetables. Prefrontal lobotomies were popular in the 50s and the 60s. Well, that gave way to the introduction of psychotropic medication. Originally, they'd put them in straitjackets, and then they'd lobotomize them. Well, first they hang them up by their feet, drill holes in their head, spin them around and around, then they'd put them in straitjackets, then they'd lobotomize them, and that gave way to psychotropic medication, which is a way of basically putting a person in a straitjacket without the straitjacket. Now, there are plenty of psychologists, plenty of psychiatrists that will argue to their death that psychotropic drugs are good. I'm one that will argue to my death that psychotropic drugs are very dangerous. They create a lot of problems. They sometimes cause more problems than they fix. And I'm not a believer. I don't think they're good. You could argue that in some cases with some patients they're beneficial. But that is not the case across the board. It's absolutely not the case across the board. And I think that we're in a very dangerous period. And we've had psychotropic drugs now for 60, 70 years. And there doesn't appear to be much on the horizon to replace them because people believe so much in drugs. My point is that we need to be searching for the alternatives. We need to look at the abilities of the human brain. The human brain can cure itself in many, many ways if you give it a chance. And by cure itself, I mean you get into psychological issues if it's not physiologically based. In other words, some physical damage to the nervous system. If it's just a psychological problem, then you can work out of that in many cases. Not all, many. But psychologists are not willing to do it. Psychiatrists are not willing to do it. To conclude, I want to thank everyone for buying the Look For Me series, for reading the books, share the stories with your friends. Go to the website. There's a backstory there you can read, and also there's places you can post questions. I'll try to answer as many as I can. Especially make a review and tell me what you think of the stories as you go. Not at the end, but when you finish each book, get your cell phone out, do a review, tell me what you think, post it on the website so other people can see what you think. When you go places, different places, or just in your backyard, set the books up, take a picture, and send those. We'll put those in our, what we call the Picks bag. People have already started doing that. I love to know where you're from, different parts of the world. I appreciate it so much. What you've done is you've given me the ability to do what I enjoy the most, which is to research and write and explore this great universe that we live in. My name is Douglas Kirk, and I thank you so much.